I was instrumental in a new approach in understanding science called the sociology of scientific knowledge. If you go on Wikipedia, you'll see I'm famous for having founded a field called social construction of technology, which is for understanding how society gets in and culture gets inside of technology. And then the third one is this area of sound studies. And I just edited with a Dutch historian of sound, Karen Westerveld, Oxford Handbook of Sound Studies, which is all about sound in science, technology, and medicine, and some in, of course, music. So it's trying to understand why the sonic dimension has been neglected. I remember this. It was probably Richard said that, gave me an old advertisement. It was contemporary at the time. An advertisement that just said, "We want someone who can interview quantum physicists to work on a project with this guy Harry Collins down at the University of Bath." And Richard said to me, "This guy Harry, you should go for this interview. You should apply for the job, and if you get an interview, you should go for it." I did get an interview. He's got lots and lots of data, but he doesn't have a clue about theory. And finally, when I got this job with Harry, Harry said, "You've worked with Richard Whitley, and he hasn't got a clue how to interview people. I'm going to show you how to interview people." Harry hired me for a project, and he took me under his wing. I remember this, and he said, "I'm going to show you how to do the sociology of science. We're going to go out there and do those interviews together, and we're going to write a book together about this Uri Geller thing."
Which you indeed did.
He did, yeah. And he was very influenced by Peter Winch and Wittgenstein, and the idea was to write a book. The book eventually became Frames of Meaning, but it was to look at paradigm incommensurability. We were influenced by Kuhn, of course, as well. Look at paradigm incommensurability, but in a contemporaneous case.
So it came out about, what, 1981, something like that?
It came out, 82, because I came out of the whole psychedelic hippie thing. So we started to do field work in California, and one of the stipulations Harry said to me, he said, "Trev, you've got to stop wearing your mother's coat if you want to come out to California with me and do these interviews." And I had this beautiful fur coat because that's what you wear if you're a psychedelic musician in London at the time.
Were these the interviews where you would rent a car and then sell it, or you'd buy a car and sell it?
Yeah, Harry's methodology was to buy a car on the East Coast, sell it on the West Coast, and you'd make a profit, that would cover your trip. This particular trip, he took me on to California, where I had my mother's coat. He made me not take my mother's coat. That particular trip was a rental car trip. He says, "Dude, I learned so much from Harry. Your writing's dependent on what you read."
Yeah.
So I was flying with him to California, right?
Mm-hmm.
I got rid of my mother's coat, and I was sort of halfway reasonably dressed. And he leans over and he looks at what I'm reading, and I'm reading Michael Moorcock. Now, Michael Moorcock was a very interesting science fantasy writer who played with my favourite bands in London, Hawkwind. He would read science fantasy on stage while the band were playing. Totally cool. Harry looks at this and he starts to read it, and it's not that well written. He says, "Trevor, this is absolute crap. If you're going to..." I'm on the plane going to California, this is probably 1978, and we're doing this field work of these parapsychologists out in California. This is where I first met Bruno, by the way, on the same trip. And he looks at it and he says, "If you're going to work with me on this project, this is the paranormal project, you're going to learn to read well as write well." And so he gave me, and he asked me, "What have you read?" Imagine this, he just says, "Steve, what have you read?" So I'd read a few things, like Hemingway and stuff like that, but I was a physicist. And he gave me a reading list, like Flann O'Brien, The Third Policeman, some really good literature to read. And I actually took it seriously. I took this away and read it, but I do have one resentment about it, because as we know, science fantasy and science fiction has a big impact in our field. And I could have been writing that stuff. I stopped reading science fiction and science fantasy to read this higher literature because Harry had instructed me to, but it probably was good for my writing.
The early 80s?
1982. I was unemployed. There were no jobs in Britain in sociology. It was a really desperate situation.
Well, I remember
Thatcher was in power.
Yeah.
Remember Thatcher famously said society doesn't exist, so there are no jobs.
But you ended up at York, but that was after a gap.
It's a huge shock. You've got to understand what this is like. I'd written a book with Harry. I'd got my own various articles done. You're in what you perceive as this cutting-edge field, and then you're on the dole. It's not great.
Well, as you were...
Being on the dole in Britain means you're basically broke.
You were actually on the dole.
Yeah, oh yeah.
How long was the gap?
I think it was on the dole for about 3 months.
Oh.
And then I ran into, what happened was I was at a conference. Harry sent me to a conference at Deutschlandsberg in Austria.
And you're still living in Bath.
Yeah, I was living in Bath, and I met this guy, this Dutch guy, Weber Baker.
Oh.
And I'd worked on this solar neutrino stuff. I also had, for a time, I had a project on something called solar oblateness, which is another interesting controversy in physics. And I even had a little sign on my door, the Center for the Sociology of the Sun, and it was kind of a joke, you know, that this is what I was doing. And I went to this conference, and I was giving a paper, I think, on the social construction of solar neutrinos, and I met this Dutch guy who was giving a paper on the social construction of the bicycle, and that was Weber Baker. And Weber had come to that conference. This actually was the first meeting ever of East.
Where was the conference again?
In Deutschlandsberg in Austria.
And this was the first East?
This is the first ever East. Yeah, turned into East, the first ever East meeting. And Weber had come to that meeting because he knew there was this social construction of science stuff going on. But let me just tell you one other thing, meeting Bruno Latour for the first time. So that fieldwork trip to California, Bruno was at the Salk Institute,
right.
And he organized a little meeting at the Salk Institute. And it was my first ever talk in America. So he had a little conference. Karen Knorr-Sutina was there, Aaron Sickle was there. I stayed with Joe Gusfield in his house.
He just died last year.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah. Wonderful guy. Wrote some really important early stuff on
disco.
disco.
Do you remember what year that was? That was
this was probably about 78, 79, sometime around there.
Just as they were finishing the book on laboratory life.
Yeah, he was still working, so it must have been 78. It was probably, it may have even been 77 actually, thinking about it. So Bruno had this little conference, and I'd never been anything like it. I was, you know, I didn't have, at this stage I was working with Harry, didn't have my PhD, and we were at the Salk Institute. Bruno was there, and you know, Randall Collins was also there as well. And
he was on faculty there.
I mean, people like Aaron Sickle, these were like, you know, legendary people for some master's student to me. And so we're going to give a talk at this little conference at the Salk Institute, and for some reason I was giving the first presentation. So there's this conference, all these scientists for the Salk Institute were there, Francis Crick, Jonas Salk himself, and I was talking about parapsychology, this little paper on fraud in parapsychology, which was eventually published in Social Studies of Science, I think my second ever publication. And I gave this, I was so nervous, my first talk in America, and all these famous people there, never mind the social, you know, the scientists, and I give this paper, and how did it go down? And the first question came from Jonas Salk himself, and Jonas Salk said, this is a really great important project, you know, because it turns out that Jonas Salk was really into parapsychology. And so he thought this was really interesting. I was talking at the Salk Institute about parapsychology, and once Jonas Salk had spread the holy water on you,
wow.
So things were great. You know, here I was. Like,
your career was launched by Jonas Salk's parapsychology.
So Weber invites me to come to Twente and work on a project with him where I'm comparing my case studies and
he had some money for you to do that.
He had some money for me to do it. So yeah, I'm going to do. I was completely out of it. I had my little VW white Beetle. I drove on to the ferry from Harwich to the Hook of Holland. Arrived in the Netherlands and the Hook of Holland. And I remember, and I was so out of it. I said to this Dutch immigration guy, I said, I'm heading to this place called Onsheed. And he sort of looked at me. What do you mean Onsheed? And so I said, I had to spell it out for him. He said, you mean Enschede. That's where Twente University is, and it's right in the sticks, the middle of nowhere. And I was there in the middle of nowhere, I think for 6 months, with Weber, and we were in a place called the Boerderij, which is Dutch for the farm, a really beautiful building. And under the leadership of this guy, Peter Bosma, and that's when we developed the idea of writing a paper comparing the sociology of science to the sociology of technology, and that came to the whole social construction Scott thing.
Right.
And you could see immediately that that you could apply some of these ideas we were developing about the empirical program relativism, interpretive flexibility, to be developed, closure, the impact of the wider society. You could think about technology in those terms. Just a question of which case study we use. And once we, Weber had this bicycle case study, it was so great. It was the perfect study for it, and it was. It wasn't called Scott then, though. It was called something unification program. We went up to. I was giving a talk up in Edinburgh University, And David Edge said you can't call it something like the Unification, because at the time there was the Church of Unification, which was the Moonies. And David said you don't want to be associated with the Moonies. So he said you can't call it this unification program. So he said let's think of another name. It's David Edge actually came up with the name Scott, Social Construction of Technology, and because he's Scottish we thought this is a great name. So we said nice one, David. Yeah, Scott. So what happened was there were no jobs, so I'd done this thing with Viva. This is before it was published. I came back to Bath. There were no jobs in Bath. I was unemployed again, on the dole. So I'd done this project with Viva, and I thought this was an interesting project. I was publishing this thing on the in externality. So in my own mind, I'd written a book on parapsychology. I was kind of like, had been successful, but there was still no job, so I was really desperate. I started to apply for all sorts of jobs, and I applied for administrative jobs. Couldn't get them because I had all these publications. They thought I would never make it as an administrator. And
this
then
is
I got,
actually, not to interrupt too badly, but this is actually inspiration for some of our students on the job market today if they can hang in there.
absolutely, yeah. I mean, it was a really tough time, and I knew I had done this work, and I just hoped I'd get a job. And I remember, out of the blue, I got a letter inviting me for an interview for a job at York University, where Michael Mulcahy was. He was going on leave for a year. It was a 2-year job, and the other year was going to be replacing a famous British sociologist called Laurie Taylor, a media sociologist, Laurie Taylor. So I'd be replacing the two of us. A 2-year job. I went up to interview, and I thought probably not going to get this because I didn't know any sociology. They wanted me to teach introductory sociology, the real deal. York was a great sociology department. I had a typical British PhD in sociology. I'd learned everything from Harry and Richard Whitley. So how was I going to teach Goffman, Weber, all this stuff? I remember Laurie Taylor asking me this question, how was I going to do it? And I said, well, I don't know much sociology, I said, but I'm going to be reading the stuff with the students. I'll be a few pages ahead of them, and I'll probably tell a joke or two. And Laurie Taylor apparently liked that.
Yeah, very good.
And so they hit Mulcahy, and the reason Mulcahy liked me, I'd done a review. And I always say...
You hadn't met him before?
I never met him before. I've done a review of his book. You know that book, Science and the Sociology of Knowledge?
It's a very key book.
Yeah, and I'd reviewed it for the 4S newsletter. And I'd started to do, it was one of my first ever book reviews, and Mike Mulcahy gave me the job he told me, because he read that review, and he said, I was one of the few people that actually appreciated what a great book that was. Most people, he had got typical academic, he had lots of enemies, and people were always sort of mealy-mouthed in their praise for him. I was just like, this is a great book. And he was really thrilled by that, and so that's another reason I got the job. So it was a 2-year job, and just to show you how desperate things were, if you've been unemployed, been on the dole, you know what this is like. I was looking at, I had a girlfriend with a little kid, and I remember this when the letter came, it was before email and all that stuff, I jumped up and said to this Laura, her name was, she was like 3 or 4 years old, I said, I got a job, I got a job, I got a job. And they were just dancing around like crazy, because it meant that much to me, because I could tell that was the difference between, so many people weren't getting jobs, and I probably would have had a very different life if I hadn't got that job. So it was interesting working with Mulcahy, by the way, because I'd worked with Harry, and he showed me how to do all these interviews and how to write and so on. Mulcahy showed me how to teach. Mulcahy was the greatest teacher I've ever seen.
Really?
Yeah, oh yeah, fantastic.
Because he's such a deadpan guy.
Oh no, he was a fantastic teacher, and he had this skill that he'd talk with the students. The students asked them questions, and they would give some fairly muddled answer, and he'd always pick out the bit of gold in the answer and turn it back on them, and this would give them confidence. And he was, Harry would just say that's crap, and imply that you shouldn't be in the same room as the great Harry. Mulcahy was a gentler style of teaching, so I learned a lot from him. A very different style to Harry, and he was a good writer as well, Mulcahy. Yeah, well, we had a conference, so we'd written that book, the article on the social construction of technological systems, and then we decided to have a conference. We decided to have a conference in the Netherlands. And that conference was a kind of landmark conference because a bunch of historians of technology came, like famously Tom Hughes, Ed Constant, sociologists of technology. Bruno was there, doing the early stuff that led to Science in Action. Michel Callan was there, John Law was there, presenting. And so that led to that book, the school bus book, and we were lucky enough to have Tom Hughes author that thing with us. Maybe he was lucky to work with us, I don't know. But we were nobodies. That was the amazing thing. I just realised in hindsight that Tom Hughes is the same age as I am when he did that with us.
Oh, really?
And he's a famous guy. He's like, he got an endowed chair at University of Pennsylvania. He is the man in the history of technology. And he did this with Weber and me, who'd never trained a student in our life. And at that point, we still didn't have permanent jobs, either Weber or me. And he edited this book with us. What a break.
Yeah, yeah.
Studying sellers
Yeah.
with Colin Clark.
Kind of a conversation analytic.
Yeah. I thought, what are you going to do? You're in York. I'm always interested in learning. You learn from the people you're with. I learned from Harry. I learned from Michael Mulcahy. And there was this incredible CA group there. Paul Drew, Tony Wotton, and they were doing. Gail Jefferson would come over. Anita Pomerantz. So I was hanging out with these people. Why not learn from them? And so I was learning some CA from them, and we did video analysis of sellers. Suddenly, from being this guy who hadn't got a job and was this junior lecturer at York with this new blood lectureship, people said, there's a chair at Keele, you should apply for it. And I did apply, but I didn't get it. And there's a chair at Loughborough with this guy, a really great group, a guy called Mick Billick, and I went there, was interviewed, and didn't get it. So from being kind of like a nobody, this was really taking off. Then I got a letter out of the blue, still no, before email, from Sheila Jasanoff. And it was like, would you like to edit what turned out to be the second handbook in STS?
Oh, it started that early. Okay.
Started that early. I got this letter from her from York, and there was a PS to those, and by the way, we have a job at Cornell. Maybe you'd be interested in applying. And that was the job at Cornell I eventually got.
And was it 89, 90, something like that?
So I figured I'd been interviewing for professorships in England and hadn't got them. Why not try for this one in America? I'd done a lot of my field work in America on the solar neutrino books. I'd actually even visited Cornell before, and so I knew a little bit about Cornell. So I thought, let's apply for this job. And I got it.
Was that job you increasingly got into sound studies?
Yeah, for writing the book on Moog, I realized that sound was the bigger topic. I hadn't realized that. I thought it was about musical instruments, and I realized sound is the bigger topic. So then Weber had invited me over to Maastricht. I met Karen Besterfeld, and she worked on sound with me, wrote early papers, and so we
did that special issue of social studies.
Yeah, we did a special issue. We called it music. We presented that at Bielefeld 4S meeting, and we called it Facing the Music. And we were going to do a special issue for David Edge, and it never happened. So it finally came out much, much later. The field wasn't ready for that stuff then.
And you didn't start your Moog synthesizer project by then, did you?
No, that came in about '95.
Okay.
And I slowly realised, through being at Cornell, that this guy Robert, I always thought it was Moog because I thought it was a made-up name. I thought it was Moog, the sound of the synthesizer. And I realised there was a real engineer called Robert Moog, and he'd been at Cornell. And he was building synthesizers in this tiny little place north of Ithaca. And as I played and built synthesizers, so this was a chance to revisit my psychedelic roots. It's very rare that this happens in your life, that you get to study something you're passionate about. So I had that career as a psychedelic musician that hadn't gone anywhere, become an academic, and I could revisit it through the lens of being an academic, because I was doing sociology technology, this was technology, and I could do it legitimately. And how many projects can you do where you can interview engineers and rock stars, and it's kind of legitimate research? And I got a grant from the Smithsonian Lemonson Center for the Study of Innovation. This guy Frank Trocco, who was doing a PhD, joined me. We did the interviews around America, and we were interviewing the synthesizer player from Frank Zappa, Keith Emerson of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. I thought, man, this is research. This is great. And nobody had written that book on Moog, which was amazing. Because he'd been marginalised, because the Cornell music department was a pretty straight music department. They didn't understand what this weird electronic stuff this guy Robert Moog was doing.
Hey there, this is Inverse Room, John Lennon, and I'm visiting my friend Trevor Pinch, who has agreed to demonstrate his DIY modular synth for us. Trevor, by the way, you might know him as the author of Analog Days, The History of the Analog Synthesizer, among other books, and he's also a professor of science and technology studies at Cornell University, and a musician. And I saw him perform with this thing the other night and thought it would be good to have a video that demonstrated it.
Right.
So
I built this synth in 1973 in London, played it out for a couple of years,
packed it up, it got destroyed in a move here to the States, and I've been rebuilding it over the last 9 months, and it's been an insane project. I get one thing working and something else will burn out, but a good bit of it's working. Just listen, let's see what this sound we've got at the moment. This joystick. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll show how the patching works. I'll build something up and show you what the modules are, John. I'm always a great believer, and you did this into your presidency, that going to a meeting should be a fun thing. Mm-hmm. And so, you've got to have lots of parties as well, and a great banquet. And
yeah. You've been part of this field for over 30 years.
Yeah, my first 4S meeting was the second. I guess it wasn't that first one, it was the next one.
What do you make of the trajectory of the society, current, future trajectory?
Well, it's a big, rambunctious, funky society. It's got so huge, and I think when it was smaller, and SSK was the kind of dominant, people say you're doing lab studies or controversy studies, and it was kind of nice. But now it's just like about like 20 parallel streams. There's just so much stuff happening. Mm-hmm. But it's still an incredibly friendly meeting, and it's important for what's so great about this meeting is, and this happened to me, that new scholars can meet the more senior scholars in the field, and they just really get on well together. We've got something going here where they can learn from each other, and maybe that's to do with the social side of 4S. I don't know, and it's always been a great meeting for that. So anyone, it's usually the usual story. They're out there. That I'm doing this weird stuff on science, medicine, whatever. Technology, and where am I going to present this? 4S, I've discovered 4S, and people find it as their home. And so that's been my observation of 4S. It's always been a place for these kindred spirits to meet, and they and it's got bigger, and the other societies seem to be, I'm not sort of boasting about it, but it does seem to be going from strength to strength in terms of size anyway. There's always worries about this thing spinning out of control ever since I've been in it. I've just realized it's just going to spin. We'll always have that worry. Yeah. And in 10 years people will be saying the same thing. Maybe in hopefully 100 years, this is out of control.